Bible to Exodus chapter 18. Exodus 18. Exodus 18 is a story about leadership and leaders. So I want to read this text. It's got two sections to it. I'll read the first section and then we'll speak to it for a few minutes and then we'll read the second section. The first section is what I'm going to call a reunion. And it starts in verse 1. So let me read there and then we'll pick up the story and take a look at a few things. Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard of all that God had done for Moses and for Israel's people, how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. Now Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, had taken Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he had sent her home, along with her two sons. The name of one was Gershon, for he said, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. And the name of the other, Eliezer, where he said, the God of my father was my help and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and with his wife to Moses in the wilderness where he was encamped at the mountain of God. And when he had sent word to Moses, I, your father-in-law, Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and her two sons with her. Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, bowed down and kissed him. And they asked each other of their welfare and went into the tent. Then Moses told his father-in-law all that the Lord had done to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians, for Israel's sake, for the hardship that had come upon them in the way, and how the Lord had delivered them. And Jethro rejoiced for all the good that the Lord had done to Israel, and that he had delivered them out of the hand of the Egyptians. Jethro said, Blessed be the Lord, who has delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians and out of the hand of Pharaoh, and has delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods, because in this affair he dealt arrogantly with the people. And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and sacrifices to God, and Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law before God. The second half of the text is what I'm going to call re-education, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. But let's just work on the first one first, the reunion situation. This is a story of Moses' immediate family being reunited with him in the middle of the wilderness. We can pretty much assume, because there's not a lot of detail in Exodus chapter 4, about what happened to Zipporah. He took her with him to go to Egypt, and then somewhere along the line between Egypt and Midian, he sent her back home. We don't know when that happened. Maybe they got to Egypt and said, we can't stay here. There's no place for us to live. Sent them back home, or they were somewhere in the wilderness. There was an incident in there where Zipporah had the oldest son circumcised, and that was a challenging situation. But at some point, Moses said, you guys need to go back home. Go with your dad, take two boys with you, etc., and send them back home. Now, and in the process of things, it was probably the whole duration of the 10 plagues, the entire incident of crossing the Red Sea, and at least 2 to 3 months in the wilderness. So they were gone quite a while. Before we get to that, to kind of looking at those details, let me just talk to you about Midian for a few minutes. Who are these people? Midian was one of the 6 sons of Abraham. Abraham had 3 sex partners. His wife, Sarah, his concubine, Hagar, and a second wife after Sarah died named Keturah. He had one son by Hagar named Ishmael, and because of the problems with Hagar and Sarah, Abraham sent him off. And Ishmael is the father of the Arab race as a whole. Okay? Then he had a miraculous birth by Sarah, who was 90 years old when she had a baby. Abraham was 100. And he's the son of promise. And then things developed, and Sarah got pretty old. She died. Abraham lived to be 165, so he wasn't a young buck either. And so when he died, Isaac was 65 years old. Kind of like most of us when our parents died. But somewhere after when Sarah died, he married a woman named Keturah. And by Keturah, he had 6 more boys. Those boys were born in Canaan. But like he did with Hagar, he sent them off. He kept Keturah with him, and he sent the 6 boys off. And the boys were had some strange names, but one of them was named Midian. He's the father of the Midianites. So Moses married in the family, in some regard. He married a distant relative. The Midianites were his relatives at some level, I guess. In some regard, we're all relatives because we all came from the same person originally. But this was a pretty common thing. So there's no rules in the life of Israel when Moses married Zipporah. He met this gal. She was not a Hebrew of Hebrews, but she was from the loins of Abraham, their ancestor. We also learned that Jethro, who's an interesting character, has at least 4 different names in the text. He's named Jethro in Exodus 3, verse 1. His name is Reuel in Exodus 2. His name is Jether in Exodus 4. And his name is Hobab in Numbers chapter 10 and Judges chapter 4. And this was also a common thing in the ancient world. People didn't have just one name. They sometimes had 3 or 4. And Jethro was one of those guys, but that person keeps popping up in different locations along the way. So I want to talk about what's going on here in the story. How do you suppose news got around in the ancient world? Yesterday, Tua, the quarterback for Alabama, got injured during the game, so the buzz world just exploded with pictures and all kinds of. So we all knew within 3 minutes that it happened, that something awful happened. We just knew that quick. Okay? You were watching the game, or my sister texted me, "You're not going to believe what happened to Tua." What? So I looked it up, and sure enough, there's just all kinds of speculation. So news in our present world is just literally moments away. Something happens 100 miles from here, we know about it 3 seconds later. What about in the ancient world? It's a much different environment. So Zipporah and the 2 boys go back to Jethro. He lives in Midian, which is probably somewhere in the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. And he's a big sheep farmer. He's got shepherds and working for him and sheep. And he hears about what's going on in Egypt. Now keep in mind that Egypt is the world's great military power. This is a very world-class culture and organization. So he hears things coming through these caravans that go through Egypt and bring goods there and bring goods back. He hears what's going on in Egypt. So he gets this kind of second, third-hand caravan news that just drops in on him. So he's heard about all this stuff, and he also hears about the 10 plagues. Crossing the Red Sea probably was one of those incidences that was pretty foggy because the people who reported these things weren't there. They just heard about it. So it's getting pushed down the line. And so Jethro says, "We need to go check this out. Plus, you guys need to go back to your husband, and the 2 boys need to go with." So he brings them with. So that's how news traveled in the ancient world. So people didn't get news quick like we do, so we can't think about things in that particular regard. The second part is that families lived apart from each other. In my last church, there was numerous Filipinos in our church who hadn't seen their family in 5 years. What? They'd chit-chat maybe on the phone or something like that. They have family members who haven't seen each other in 10 years. Because they just work somewhere. Filipinos worked all over the ancient world, that we call the ancient world. They worked in Saudi Arabia, in different places in Indonesia. I mean, on the coast of the Indian Ocean and stuff like that, they worked everywhere. So families, in our world, you know, if you're away from your spouse for 6 months, it's like horrible. Like my son was deployed to the Middle East for 6 months. I was like, oh, this is stressing me out. In our story right here, families lived apart pretty regularly. Moses was a shepherd, so how long was he gone with sheep looking for grass all summer long? Who knows? So this was not an uncommon situation, fairly common. He says, I think you've been with me long enough, I need to take you back to your husband. Okay? So that's a pretty common third thing. And then families reunited. And so these were big affairs. Parties, and food, and everything else. When Moses got word that his father-in-law was coming, he said, he went out to meet him, verse 7. And his actions toward him were respectful and cordial. He kisses him. Pretty common thing. Seeking to know the nature of their lives apart. So they have this big conversation that starts, and they go into Moses' tent. So that's what's going on in the story right here. Nothing unusual about the story. And he told his father-in-law all that God had done. So his father-in-law said, this is what I've heard about what's going on. What's going on in your world? And so Moses said, well, let me tell you a first-hand account of what actually happened in Egypt. I was in Pharaoh's court, and I was the person who was dropping the hammer on him with 10 plagues. Probably just lined him up and said, this is what happened. Jethro was just kind of mulling this stuff over in his head like, wow, it's a little different than what I heard about. And then we come to verse 10. Look at verse 10. This is where the commentators kind of split on this whole issue. Did he actually just, oh, that's really cool, you have a great God, or did he actually step into the mystery of Yahweh and embrace Yahweh as his God? We can't really tell. Let's read the text. Blessed be the Lord who has delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians and out of the hand of Pharaoh, and has delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now here's the critical piece. Now I know, and that particular phrase in Hebrew is an interesting one, I'll get back to it in a moment, that the Lord is greater than all gods. Is he saying he's greater than my God and the gods that I've been worshiping my whole life? We really can't tell. Because of this affair, they dealt arrogantly with the people. Then it says, and Jethro brought it, he made the statement, he brought a burnt offering and sacrifices to God. There's an awful lot of surface evidence right here that this man stepped into the light of what God was doing. The formula, now I know, is an interesting one. It's regularly used to describe recognition of God's work amongst men. The best parallel is in 1 Kings 17, verse 24, where in response to Elijah's miracle, the widow of Zarephath says, now I know that you are a man of God. So that phrasing right there says, I believe. Not just, oh, I processed this information. I believe. It literally communicates that general idea. Up to this point, God had not ordered the sacrificial system that Moses would reveal in time, yet the patriarchs all built altars and they all sacrificed to God. So what Jethro does after that is just like the patriarchs. So there's an awful strong indication this man stepped into the light of God's grace as a foreigner, someone who's not part of the nation of Israel. The question remains, what is the meaning of this act by Jethro? And on its surface, we may see movement in the heart of Jethro towards the one true God. But you can't tell, okay? There's not enough evidence. You know I'm a Christian because I testified to it and my life demonstrates it. We don't have any life experience for Jethro, he disappears. Okay? Here's an interesting idea. Abraham had 8 sons, but only one of them was the first Hebrew. Abraham was not a Hebrew, he was a Mesopotamian. So was Sarah. Isaac is considered to be the first Hebrew, and he's the father of the Hebrew nation. God said, this is the promised son, and he's the one who's going to be promised, who's going to get all the blessings that I have for the people of Israel. That's Isaac. He was born by miraculous intervention by God. All the rest were children born by natural means. During this particular little epiphany, some interesting things happened. After Moses has them come into his tent, here comes Aaron and here comes the elders. And they just watch. The priest of Midian sacrificed to God, and Aaron's standing right there. He's sitting in the tent. And he eventually becomes the high priest, the first high priest of Israel. Okay? Draw your own conclusions from that. The mighty acts of God in rescuing Israel from the Egyptian bondage and leading them over the Red Sea was not only a statement to Israel, but it was also a powerful testimony to the watching world. Keep this in mind. What God does is a statement to the whole world. But that doesn't lead people to Jesus. They still need to hear something. Jethro was probably curious, like, wow, what's going on? But not until Moses sat down and told him what God had done that he began to understand what's going on. And that's true for me and you too. We hear about things all the time, but until people sit down with us and explain who God is and what he's done, we really don't know what's going on. Jethro's statement, let's look at that first. When God acts, people can be affected, calling them to consider the one true God. That's what happened in our story. Yet they must hear the truth to respond and come to faith. So the fact that he knew about all this stuff is important. God is always working in the world. There's plenty of people who see what God does and they reject the explanation. You can tell them about it, and they reject it. Oh, that was just happenstance. Or that's just how things play out. This guy got lucky. We assign the curious movings of God to some pretty strange things sometimes. Let's move on. Re-education, verse 13. The next day Moses sat to judge the people, and the people stood around Moses from morning till evening. When Moses' father-in-law saw all that he was doing for the people, he said, "What is it that you are doing for the people? Why do you sit alone? And all the people stand around you from morning till evening." And Moses said to his father-in-law, "Because the people come to me and to inquire of God. When they have a dispute, they come to me and I decide between one person and another and make them know the statutes of God and his laws." Moses' father-in-law said to him, "What you are doing is not good. You and the people with you will certainly wear yourselves out. The thing is too heavy for you. You are not able to do it alone. Now obey my voice. I will give you advice, and God will be with you. You shall represent the people before God and bring their cases to God. And you shall warn them about the statutes and the laws and make them know the way in which they must walk and what they must do. Moreover, look for able men from all people, men who fear God, who are trustworthy and hate a bribe, and place such men over the people as chiefs of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, of tens. And let them judge the people at all times. Every great matter they shall bring to you, but any small matter they shall decide themselves. So it will be easier for you, and you will bear the burden with you. If you do this, God will direct you. You will be able to endure, and all this people will also go to their place in peace." So Moses listened to the voice of his father-in-law and did all that he had said. Moses chose able men out of all Israel and made them heads over the people, chiefs of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens, and they judged the people at all times. Any hard case they brought to Moses, but any small matter they decided themselves. Then Moses let his father-in-law depart, and he went away to his own country. In the ancient world, kings had direct interaction with subjects, and the Old Testament gives testimony to that. 2 Samuel chapter 15, David's the king. But Absalom is at the door of the palace. He's at the door of, he's in Jerusalem, really close to the palace. And as people were coming to the king, he didn't have time for you. They just thought, well, actually, I need to go talk to the king. No problem, no security issues, just walk right in there. And Absalom says, oh, I can solve your problem, my dad's too busy. So it was a pretty common thing for people who had an issue wherever they lived, just go talk to the guy, the big cheese in charge. How about in 1 Kings, I think it's 1 Kings, let me look. 1 Kings chapter 3, there's a story about Solomon. And there's two prostitutes who each have a baby, and one of them slept on the baby and killed the baby that night. How does this particular thing end up in the king's palace? This is Solomon, man. He's the richest, wisest guy in the face of the earth. And he's dealing with two prostitutes, one of them who accidentally slept on her baby and the baby died. Yeah, because in the ancient world, if you had an issue, you took it to the king. Well, there's 600,000 fighting men in Israel's company, plus everybody else. So there's probably 2 million people out there. So how many problems do you think there are in any given day? It must be staggering. Some of you guys work at school over there, and the problem that they have with 250 kids, little kids, and the teachers and all that stuff, it can be overwhelming. So this must have been a mess. And all these people just watched this happening. And Jethro's thinking, this guy's out of his mind, he's going to kill himself. So he, like a good father-in-law, steps in. Speaks into the situation. Here's a question I want to ask you. Does truth have to come from someone who's a fellow believer, or can we hear truth from someone who may not be a believer, but nevertheless is an instrument of God to speak truth into your life? So I don't really know if Jethro's a believer, but he gives some pretty sound advice in this whole story. Really sound advice. As a matter of fact, his advice leads to a style of leadership in all of Israel from then on. He must have had a pretty good relationship with his father-in-law. And Jethro's question in verse 14 has one word that points to the problem. Look at verse 14. Why do you sit alone? And all the people stand around you from morning till evening. He just focused on that single word right there. I'm going to solve this problem of you doing this all by yourself. Okay? So here's something that comes out of there for me. Leadership is responsible for effectiveness. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Management is responsible for efficiency. Leadership is responsible for what needs to be done. Management is responsible for getting it done. Or in other words, leadership is responsible for effectiveness and management is responsible for efficiency. When I was a kid, my grandfather, I occasionally would stay at his house over a weekend. And one time, more than once, we had to cut down a Dutch elm tree there because he got sick. But he never used a chainsaw. You're killing me, Grandpa. Okay. And these things were, I don't know, 40 feet tall. Pretty good sized tree. We want to cut the tree down. So we get a bucket of water and an axe and a file. Now, is that the efficient way to cut down a tree? It is completely inefficient. He had a chainsaw. He put the axe in the water, swallowed the head so the head would not fly off. And he sat there with the file and just sharpened that blade. He said, in chit-chat with Mark about efficiency, the project is decided. We're going to cut down the tree. So separating in my mind, this is what we're going to do. We made that decision. This tree is ill, needs to be cut down. And then he said, we're not going to be efficient about cutting the tree apart, but I am going to be very efficient about training you on the difference between effectiveness and efficiency. So we spent a half an hour sharpening the stupid blade. I think, this is going to take us all day long. It took all day long. Cut all the limbs off, get all the brush out of there, clean the whole place up, took a whole day. It should have been done in 3 hours. So efficiency is a really important thing, but that's secondary to effectiveness. Moses, what is Moses' response to Jethro? These people need to be judged. Jethro says, yeah, you're right. But the efficiency of what you're doing doesn't make any sense. So he steps in and says, what you're doing is right, but how you're doing it could be done better. That's a really interesting distinction right here. Moses responds with transparency and candor. Look at verse 15. And Moses said to his father-in-law, because the people came to me to inquire of God, when they have a dispute, they come to me, and I decide between one person and another, and make them know the statutes of God and his laws. I'm just doing what I know to do. This is how the ancient world worked. All the power resided in the guy who's in front. The big guy, the big cheese sitting on the throne. Jethro responds to a statement that speaks to Moses' health as a leader. What you are doing is not good, he says in verse 17 and 18. You and the people with you will certainly wear themselves out, for the thing is too heavy for you. You are not able to do it alone. What he says in the next verse, verse 18, now obey my voice. Is God speaking right now? He might be, through a guy named Jethro. Now obey my voice. I will give you advice, and God will be with you. It's like he steps into this position for a moment and speaks for God. It's in the Bible. Doing the right thing is always important. That's the critical decision. How you do it is sometimes less important. I'm somebody who thinks about efficiency in my own work life. How do I efficiently get this done? Because I don't want to spend all my time on this, just doing stuff. And Moses probably should have thought about the same thing. Doing the right thing is never unimportant. Doing it less than efficiently can often not matter at all. Like cutting out a stupid tree with axe. One axe. Okay, you take 25 swings and I'll take 25 swings. And his swings were slow. And my swings were wild. So it took a long time to get this tree cut down. There will be moments when time is of the essence, but often there are important lessons for how to do it, things that matter more than the time it takes to get it done. In this case, there were important reasons to change how this activity was being done, and Jethro points them out. First of all, it's wearing you out, Moses. That's a good point. Secondly, it was wearing out the people. Third, it was not being used to train others so that Moses could be utilized in the most important cases. Those are the three reasons he gives. Those are three valid reasons for efficiency to be readdressed. Doing the right thing is always important, and in leadership, it is vital. As for how it's done, it just kind of depends. Look in verse 22 and 23. So it will be easier for you, and they will bear the burden with you. Let's share this burden, he said. It's not carry it all on top of your shoulders all by yourself. He says, if you do this, God will direct you. You will be able to endure, and all his people will go to their place in peace. It's an interesting little series of things right there. Okay? I want to give you some thoughts on biblical leadership to kind of wrap this thing up. Okay? I think I got 6 things down here. Over the past 50 plus years, we have lived in a culture that touts the leadership training of the national military and the business world. They are considered to be experts at identifying and training people in leadership and identifying and training people in the business, etc. So those two places are oftentimes where the church reaches into those places right there and drags their principles into the body of Christ. And there may have been a time when that was really good, but those models are more and more void of biblical foundations as we grow more and more into an amoral and a biblically illiterate culture. So I like to go back to the Word of God and say, what does he have to say? We have taken too many cues from these two groups, and it's time that we return to the biblical models That should be the foundation for church leadership. The Bible does not major on the topic of leadership, but it does speak to it in subtle ways, sometimes very specific ways, more specific in the New Testament than the Old Testament, because the Old Testament models are just the way that culture ran. And here's a man who's a sheep farmer who speaks into the life of a world-class leader, a guy named Moses. Is what Moses is being challenged with by his father-in-law prescriptive for all time or descriptive of solving an immediate problem? That's an important question to ask. I would submit that it's descriptive of a mindset in the leadership model of ministry. And I want to point some of those things out. It involves more people, it cares for the leader, and it simply makes much better sense. Okay? So let's take a look at these things right here. First of all, the Bible says that God selects and calls spiritual leadership. Leadership models of culture are built around presence, skills, influence, natural abilities, but God looks on the inside rather than the outside in its presentations. Exodus chapter 3, verse 10. What does Moses say to God? You got the wrong man. I am not your God. What did God say to Jesse? You have any more sons left? He already looked at all these people. Samuel's going, this has got to be the guy. And what did God tell Samuel? Man looks on the outward appearance, but God looks on the heart. So leadership is a little different model in the eyes of God. He can see what's inside of a person. So what's inside really does matter. We learn from the pastoral epistles that God looks at character and faithfulness and a love for God's people. God chose Moses, but he had some shortcomings, and he needed a little bit of help. Second one, leaders hear and obey the voice of God and are humble and meek. In Numbers chapter 12, it says, and Moses was the meekest man on the face of the earth. That's an indication that he had more power than anybody else, and he never abused that power, or didn't make a practice out of abusing that power. That's what meekness is. Clearly understanding the power that you have and never abusing it. If a leader can't or won't hear the voice of God, follow someone else. If a leader is arrogant and prideful, follow someone else. If a leader won't do what they are asking others to do, follow someone else. A third one. The Bible indicates that what we do is of God, but how we do it is often an exercise of wisdom and the application of biblical principles. It's interesting, God calls us to do evangelism, but there's no training manual in God's Word on how to do that. God says, go make disciples of all nations, but there's no 12-point outline to get that done. He says, figure it out. Use wisdom. Apply biblical principles to the process. He's not going to direct us every step of the way like that. So this is what we're going to do. Now figure out the best way to get it done. And there's some cultures where certain styles of evangelism or discipleship just don't work. Other styles work better. Moses knew that judging was an essential activity of his leadership, but Jethro provides wise counsel and the best way to get that job done. In the stories of the judges, what God wanted these leaders to do was never in question, but how to get it done was always a combination of God's specific acts, his input, and wisdom from the battle, those who were involved in the battle. So sometimes they balance those two things out. God gave Gideon specific instructions on how to defeat the Midianites, but he didn't give Jephthah the same thing. He just told him, you're going to win. He didn't tell Ehud to stab Eglon the way he did. He just did. He didn't tell Samson to, flex his muscles and take care of business, but he just did. So there's numerous stories throughout the scriptures that say, this is what God wants us to do, but how it gets done can be really dumb or really wise. David always sought the Lord for battle, but only sometimes did God tell him the proper way to fight the battle. That was often a matter of wisdom, wise counsel. And that is a truth for all spiritual leadership. Okay? Let's go to number 4. Our story is a strong reminder that in ministry we should resist the lone wolf tendency. I had a mentor many years ago. He said, Mark, who do you take with you when you visit people? I said, I don't take anybody. He looked at me like, what, are you foolish or something? It's a training opportunity. So he figured out pretty quick, I just get things done. It's got to be done, so I just do it. He said, well, it takes a little more planning to get someone to go with you. You may have to change your time slot and stuff like that. It's an opportunity to train people to learn how to do stuff like that. There's some things you have to do by yourself, but there's so many things in ministry that should be done with other people by yourself. Moses was enjoined to get help and stop doing things alone. David began the process of building the temple, but Solomon actually took care of business. All the details were left to him. Okay? Ministry is relational, and advancing ministry is done in partnership with others for the glory of God. Number 5. There's 2 more. This is the first list of leadership qualifications in the Bible. Really? It's an interesting. It's the first list of leadership qualifications in the Bible. Look amongst the men, one who fears God, one who can be trusted, one who can resist a bribe, and empower them to carry out the specific leadership function. So there's a list of things that are in that particular pile. The list grows as the Word of God is revealed until Paul speaks to this issue in 1 Timothy and in Titus. Men should play an important leadership role in the body of Christ. And men should live lives that prepare them for leadership roles in the body of Christ. That's what it says. That's the general pattern of the scriptures from the Old Testament to the New Testament. Let me just throw this in. There are 6 Hebrew words which are translated into the Hebrew Old Testament text, which all mean man or men. And the one at the end, the one in this text right here, the word elder is the word zakim. And it was the goal of every Jewish man to eventually become a zakim. What's that? It's a person who is the center of influence in the place where he lives. That's what it boils down to. Someone who was sought for wisdom and insight and advice, that's a zakim. And no Jewish man was not on a mission to become a zakim. That was his whole life. I want to grow so that people sit around me and ask me questions and I just feed information and wisdom and biblical counsel into their lives. That was a zakim. When I learned that many years ago, I said, God, make me a zakim. I want to be one. That's not necessarily true in our culture today. We live in the moment, we don't even think about the future. One last thing. God speaks into our lives, and we must be listening with a heart to obey. You might gather from this story that the human voices that God often uses in our lives are the voices of those closest to us. I remember sitting in a premarital counseling session, and these 2 people were getting married, and this girl, she was a sharp girl, but she was strong. And the guy was, he was quiet. He didn't say much. I said to her, I said, can you stand under his leadership as the head of your home? She comes to me like, what? One gal said to me, I make more money than he does. What do you mean? And I said to him, I said, can you receive input from her, even if it's every 30 minutes? Because that's how strong she was. Here's the principle that comes out of there. God speaks to us first, to the people who are closest to us. This is Moses' father-in-law. None of his family are around. His wife's not there. Guess what? His father-in-law steps in. Someone needs to speak into your life right now, because what you're doing doesn't make any sense to me. You might have been thinking that. God speaks to me through my spouse first. Sometimes Susan reminds me of that. That's just God's pattern in the world. He speaks to me through my spouse, the people closest to me. I wrote down, he speaks to my spouse often. Through my parents first. He speaks to through them first in my life, then it's transferred to my spouse after I get married. Then through my siblings from time to time, through our children on occasion. That's pretty embarrassing. From close friends and extended family as they have a Christian biblical worldview. But God always speaks to us in the church age through the Word of God first and always. You must be listening with a heart to obey. Okay? I want to close with two simple comments, then we'll pray. The symbolism of Exodus is pervasive. And this story right here is a distinct picture of it. Here's what one commentator writes, Sailhamer, he's a pretty sharp guy. Just as Abraham was met by Melchizedek, the priest, before God made a covenant with him in Genesis 15, so Moses is met by Jethro, the priest, in Exodus 18, before God makes a covenant with him at Mount Sinai. God is a God of patterns. He just works that way. He's predictable some ways, and that takes place at this level. And to remind us that God is always working. He's speaking to us and people closest to us. When we join this congregation, God says, guess what? They're going to speak into your life. And you can say, I didn't realize he was saying that to me. I realized it today, this past week, when I was putting this together. God's using this congregation to speak into my life for any number of reasons. And finally, that comment I made to you earlier about an elder. The term elder takes on literally significance as we walk through the Old Testament. It starts in the book of Exodus. And eventually Moses has 70 people who rise up as elders in the congregation. And that 70 became sacred to the Jewish people, and the Sanhedrin had 70 people in it, plus the chief priest. There's nothing sacred about the number 7. That's just what they picked. But carrying the load on a group of people who lead together is the pattern that God has for us. Leaders and leadership. Let's pray. Father, thank you for the lessons that we can learn from this text. I pray that you'll use us to speak into the lives of others. We'll be able to hear and discern truths from people closest to us, that you'll bless us with their words of wisdom and insight. I could pray that every young man in here has a father-in-law like Jethro. And that all of us who are Jethro's age or older would be that kind of a father-in-law to our kids. So I pray, Lord, that you'll keep us in the Word so we can speak truth and biblical wisdom in the lives of people around us. I pray for marriages, that we speak to each other's lives with grace and insight from your Word. You help us as we lead in our homes and in our church. We're going to pick a couple people here in a minute to sit on our nominating committee. Give us wisdom about that. I pray that you'll